Have you ever asked yourself where the word Christian came from? What does it actually mean? And how is it that so many people throughout history, people from Mother Teresa to Barack Obama, from Tim Tebow to Dr. Martin Luther King, from Johnny Cash to Queen Victoria, Mr. Rogers, Whitney Houston, Sir Isaac Newton, Alice Cooper, Charles Dickens, Justin Bieber, from me, maybe you, to the guy who created Wendy's, how is it that all of us subscribe to the same identifying word? Merriam-Webster defines a Christian as a person who professes belief in the teachings of Jesus Christ. And yet, if you actually ask Christians out there what their namesake means, you'll get any number of different definitions. Someone who has a personal relationship with Jesus, being like Christ, or living the way Jesus lived. Do we have to be saved? Redeemed? It seems that even Christians can't agree on what it means to be a Christian. And that's because that word, Christian, actually has multiple meanings, or at least multiple layers of meaning.
There's a story about a man who was driving down the highway. He's tailgating people, honking his horn at them until they'd finally pull over. And once they pulled over to let him pass by, he would, gesture how they were number one. We all know that signal. And little did he know that there was a police officer following him. And as the police officer got closer to this guy's car, he noticed something about it that made him think something isn't right. And so he hit the lights and the siren, had the car pull over. And then as the policeman approached the car, he told the driver to get out with his hands where he could see them, and then once out of the car to assume the position. Hands on the hood, feet back, legs spread apart. And as the man stood there in this somewhat embarrassing position with all these cars driving by, the police officer went and checked the man's ID and insurance papers in the car, and oddly, they matched. And the officer, he came back to the man and he said, "Hey, you can get up off the car and turn around." And he says, "I have to apologize. It seems I made a mistake. I thought this car had been stolen." And the man goes, "Well, what are you talking about, stolen? Why would you think the car has been stolen?" And the officer replied, he says, "Well, when I saw you blowing your horn and flipping people off as you passed them, and then I saw the bumper stickers in your car that said, what would Jesus do? And follow me, I'm going to church. I just thought by the way you were driving that the car had been stolen." This is when I like being online because I have no idea how that came across. It's an oldie, but I'm just assuming you're all laughing, and so I'm going to let the laughter die down as I introduce myself. My name's Garry. I'm one of the pastors here. Really glad that you decided to spend some of your day with us this morning, and it gets better from here, I hope. As Russ mentioned, we're kicking off a brand new series today called Christian. And we decided to put it in quotation marks because, as we heard in the video, the word Christian has so many different meanings. It conjures up so many different images and emotions when we hear it, doesn't it? Wouldn't you agree with that? I mean, you ask 10 different people to define a Christian, and you're going to get multiple answers, maybe even 10 different answers. Somebody might say, well, a Christian is someone who goes to church every Sunday and they don't drive like a jerk. Or somebody might say, well, a Christian, that's someone who believes in God. Some would say, well, a Christian is someone who doesn't drink, doesn't smoke, doesn't steal, doesn't lie, doesn't cheat, pays their taxes, obeys the law, except for maybe the speed limit. Or put another way, a Christian is someone who has no fun, right? Christian. It's such a loaded term that if you were to be walking down the street and someone came up to you and asked you, hey, are you a Christian? It would be, chances are pretty good you'd probably hesitate answering. And if you did, before you answered, you'd probably ask a clarifying question, something like, why do you want to know? Why do you want to know if I'm a Christian? Some of you might say, I'm not a Christian. Never have been. Some of you might simply say, yes, I am. which would be cool. Good for you. Some of you, if you were asked if you were a Christian, may say no, even though you would consider yourself a Christian. And you would say no because you know how some of your friends or your family or coworkers or classmates, you know what they think of Christians. They see Christians as nothing more than judgmental, narrow-minded, intolerant, holier-than-thou moralists who are nothing but a bunch of hypocrites because they don't practice what they preach, kind of like the guy in the opening story. And so you just keep your mouth shut when the conversation turns to all things religion. That was my story through school and probably into my mid-20s. I knew what some of my friends thought about Christians. And so whenever the topic would come up, I would shut up. I didn't want to risk getting into an argument, maybe fracturing a friendship, so I just wouldn't say anything. Some of you, if you were asked if you were a Christian, might say, yes, but, you have the caveat, but I'm not a Christian like those Christians, right? Well, for me, maybe for you, it raises the question, where the heck did we even get this name from, this moniker, this label that's generally used to describe someone who believes in Jesus? I mean, where did we get it from? Now, you might be thinking, well, we got it from the Bible. And you'd be right. Sort of. And here's what I mean by that. The word Christian is indeed found in the Bible. And it indeed was originally used to describe people who believed that Jesus was God. But here's the thing. It wasn't a complimentary or flattering term. In fact, it was a derogatory term that was used with a sarcastic tone. And it was a term that was given to these Jesus followers by people that were outside of the community of Jesus followers. That's how we got the term Christian, the label. And interestingly, despite how synonymous that name has become with Jesus followers, it actually only appears, as we heard in the video, in the Bible 3 times. And the first time it shows up is in the book of Acts. The book of Acts is the 5th book in the New Testament. You have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are what are referred to as the Gospels, the autobiographies of Jesus, all that type of stuff. We teach out of those a lot. And then you come to the 5th book, which is called Acts. And it's so named because it describes how the church began through the acts of the early church or Jesus followers after he rose from the dead. It's that simple. This is what they did. These are the acts they performed. This is how the church started. Now, if you like adventure novels, anything like that, I would encourage you to read this book. If you've never really cracked the Bible open and read a book in its entirety, this is the one. This is probably in my top 3 of favorite books in the Bible. I mean, there is never a dull moment in this book. There's everything from earthquakes to prison breaks, riots and shipwrecks and everything in between. It's an absolutely fascinating book. And this book starts right after Jesus' resurrection, which we celebrated last week at Easter. And we read that for the first 40 days after Jesus rose from the dead, he appeared to all kinds of people, all different locations at different times. And the end result was people began believing without a doubt that Jesus was, in fact, who he said he was, God. And they believed it because he came back from the dead. And so what happened is these people began gathering together and forming these communities that we now know as the church. Now, of course, when this was happening, this absolutely ticked off the existing religious establishment. They were the ones that had Jesus killed in the first place because he was such a thorn on their side. It's just like, we got to get rid of this guy. And so they had him killed. And now there's a bunch of people running around saying, hey, we saw the risen Jesus. Hey, you should see it. And they're like, we got to stop this. And so this persecution breaks out in the city of Jerusalem, and it got really violent. There was a guy named Stephen who was kind of on the front lines of this new movement called the church, and he got into he met with these religious leaders, and he kind of let them have it. And they got super ticked And so he got stoned. Stephen got stoned, and not that kind of stoned. He got stoned by them, not with them, okay? And so these Jesus people, they heard about that, and they were like, well, this is no good. And so they scattered. They all took off out of Jerusalem, and they went to all these different cities, and a bunch of them ended up in this city called Antioch, which was located in what we now know as Turkey. And Antioch was a very affluent city. Historians say that there was one section of road, it was 4 miles long, and it was paved with marble. It was the first city in those times that had its streets lighted at night. But morally, it's kind of more Vegas-ish. So you could say what happened in Antioch stayed in Antioch, that kind of thing. And so these Jesus followers show up, and they're in this hostile environment, but they can't stop telling people what happened. They're running around and they're saying, man, I don't know if you heard what happened in Jerusalem. Man, it was just wild. I was there. It was crazy. Have you heard of this Jesus guy? Yeah, he came and he said he was the Son of God, and everyone was like, what? That can't be. But what he said was true, even because he got killed for saying that, but he came back from the dead. And I know it's hard to believe. She's like, what? He came back from the dead? Are you kidding me? It's true. I saw him. Not just me. A bunch of us saw him. A whole bunch of people saw him. And the result was a bunch of these Gentiles. A Gentile is just somebody who's not Jewish. So Canadians and all that embraced this new faith in Jesus. And just like that, a church got started in Antioch. Well, news got out what was happening in Antioch, and when the church at Jerusalem heard what had happened, they sent Barnabas, another Jesus follower, to Antioch. And when he arrived and saw this evidence of God's blessing, he was filled with joy. He's like, yeah, this is awesome. This is great. And he encouraged the believers, all these new believers, to stay true to the Lord. And what he was saying was, look, guys, I know that right now the excitement's high and you're into it, but there might come a time where you begin to doubt this new belief, this new faith that you're hanging on to. But hang in there. And then with what happens next, it's almost like Barnabas is like, these people need to be taught. And so Barnabas, we read, went to Tarsus, another city called Tarsus, to look for Saul. Now, Saul is a guy we talk about a lot around here, but we use the name Paul. Paul had two names, Saul and Paul. Saul was the name he used when Jewish, that was his Jewish name. Paul was the name he used when he was around Greeks, Romans, all the Gentiles. And here's the thing, Saul, at one time, he was at the top of the religious food chain, and he was one of the chief guys that made it his mission to wipe out all these Jesus followers. He had heard, he was like there when, we got him killed finally, and now these people are running around. We got to telling everyone he's alive. We got to stop this. And so he was right at the front line. And one day as he's heading to arrest a bunch of these Jesus followers, he has this incredible encounter with the resurrected Jesus, and the result is he becomes a Jesus follower himself. And now he can't stop telling anybody and everybody about him. And so when Barnabas, found him, Saul, he brought him back to Antioch. And look at this. It says both of them stayed there with the church for a full year, teaching large crowds of people. And then something really bizarre happens. It's almost like an afterthought. If you look in your Bible, whether online or whatever, you'll notice the next verse is in parentheses. And Luke, the guy that wrote this, it's almost like an afterthought. He finishes with that and he says, oh, it was at Antioch that the disciples were first called Christians. Interesting, these Jesus followers didn't call themselves Christians. The people outside of the community of Jesus followers that were looking in called them Christians. But the Jesus followers did call themselves something. And I would suggest it is a far scarier word than Christian. And I say that because unlike the word Christian, this word is clearly defined. The reason you can't get 10 people to define Christian the same way, The reason there are so many cults and sects and spin-offs and denominations, the reason why there has been so much confusion around what a Christian actually is or means is because Christian actually isn't defined in the Bible. Yet when you look in the Bible, there is a term that is used very consistently to describe people who were part of the Jesus movement. In fact, this word is used 250 times. And the term is disciple. Disciple. And the reason I would say it's scarier than the word Christian is because it's so clearly defined. Here's how the dictionary defines a disciple, okay? They say, someone who adheres to the teachings of another is a follower or a learner. So put another way, you could say a disciple is someone who takes up the ways of another. A great example of this, where you see this play out, is in the martial arts. So for example, if you wanted to get good at karate, you would go to a dojo and join the dojo, and you would fall under the guidance of the sensei of that dojo. And you would learn from them by listening to them, watching them, imitating them, and applying what they teach you, all so that you can become like them. And so in the context of Jesus, a disciple is someone who comes under Jesus' direction, learns from him, applying what he teaches in order to become like him. C.S. Lewis, who wrote Mere Christianity and the Narnia Chronicles and all that, for years he was a staunch atheist. And then when he met J.R. Tolkien, the guy that wrote, the Lord of the Rings books, who was a Christian, he became a Jesus follower. C.S. Lewis became a Jesus follower. And he said in Mere Christianity, he said, look, the whole thing about Christianity, there's only one thing about it. It's to become little Christs. Christianity is about nothing else. And so it's almost like he's saying you got to run around like a little junior Jesus or something like that, right? You and I, we can hide behind the word Christian all day long because you can define it in any way you like. I would even suggest that you can go so far as to undefine it so you can redefine it to justify just about any behavior. But this word disciple, not a whole lot of wiggle room there. It's pretty clear what being a disciple is all about. In fact, on the night before he was crucified, Jesus gives us the clearest example of what it means to be a disciple. During what we now call the Last Supper, Jesus gathered together his closest followers in this upper room for one last meal. They didn't know it was the last meal, but Jesus did. He knew it was coming. He had already been betrayed at this point in the evening, and he knew that next he was going to be arrested and then beaten and then executed. And so he knew, it was like, I got one last shot to teach these guys, to give them something to hang on to when everything comes spinning apart. And so it's almost, you can imagine, I'm like, okay, come here, guys, listen. Some stuff is going to happen here in the next few hours. It's absolutely going to rock you to the core. But I need you to listen to this, because this, if you do this, it will help you get through it. I want to let you know what it really means to be my disciple. And then Jesus shared with them something that was so simple, yet so profound and so powerful that when you hear what it is, you'll agree, I think you'll agree anyway, that it has the power to change not only your personal world, but the entire world. Author and pastor Andy Stanley put it this way. Listen to what he wrote when he was talking about this. He said, if we had gotten this right, if the Christians had decided, forget Christian, I'm going to be a disciple, If we had just gotten this one element of Jesus' teaching right, there may not have been any First World War. There definitely would not have been a Second World War, and slavery would have been put to rest long before it was. If we had just gotten this one teaching of Jesus right, our world would be a different and better world. That is a bold statement, isn't it? But you know what? He's absolutely right. And when you hear what Jesus said, I think you're going to agree. Here's what Jesus said to his closest followers, mere hours before he would be executed. He said to them, "A new command I give you, love one another." And they're probably sitting there going, "What do you mean new? That's not new. I mean, the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself." Like, this isn't new. Jesus is like, "No, this is new. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you're Christians." Actually, that's not what he said. He said, "As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, my apprentices, my followers, my learners, my pupils, my students, if you love one another." Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he's a famous author, pastor, respected theologian, an activist to a degree. He was actually executed in a concentration camp during World War II. He wrote this. He wrote a book called The Cost of Discipleship. And here's how he differentiates being a Christian and a disciple. Listen to this. This pushes in really, really tight. He says, "The problem is many people believe the right things in their heads about Jesus, but do not follow him. The solution is discipleship, which can be summarized as believing what Jesus believed, living the way Jesus lived, and loving the way Jesus loved." But the only way that we have any chance of doing that is when we fully embrace the cost of being a disciple. You know, being an apprentice, being a student, being a follower of Jesus, and learn to love like Jesus from Jesus himself. Christian? We can all be Christians. You can call yourself a Christian. I can call myself a Christian. Anyone can call themselves a Christian. But to be willing to love people the way Jesus loved people, man, that is something completely different. It can be hard. At times it can seem unfair, unreasonable, unrealistic. But it's the kind of love that is going to be the light that shines into the darkness of this world. It's going to stand out. That's why Jesus said, "You are the light of the world. You are a city on a hill." And when we all come together as a church and love one another in radical ways, we will shine so bright for people to see. When Jesus said, "Love as I have loved you," in essence, you know what he was saying? He was saying this. He says, "I want you to love each other in such a way, to love each other so intensely, so sacrificially, that people are going to look at the way you're loving one another, and it will draw them to me and my love like a moth to a flame. It'll be irresistible." He says, in essence, what he's saying is, I want you to create a community of people who are so defined and characterized by this ridiculous, unheard of, radical kind of love that people from the outside looking in at us will say things like, "Look how they treat their women. Look how the men are treating the women. Look how the women are treating the men. It's with this mutual love and respect and honor. Look how the adults are treating the kids. Look how the kids are respecting their parents. Look how they treat the addicted. Look how they treat the convict. Look how they treat people who are different, marginalized, ostracized. Look at how they share their time, their talents, and treasures with each other. They do it in such a way that it doesn't even look like they care about their own welfare. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know you are my disciples, if you love one another. And boy, I'll tell you, we need some of that right now. The church is the hope of the world. And when we're fighting with one another over issues, whatever it happens to be, we're seeing it all over the place right now. Meet, don't meet, get vaccinated, don't get vaccinated. It's all over the map. Why would people be attracted to that? We need to love one another. This is why it's so hard. Without Jesus, we can't do it. And so I want to leave us with a question. And it's just as much for me as it is for anyone listening this morning. TMP, are we content being known as Christians? Or do we want to be known as disciples? Do we want to be just simply known as Christians, or do we want to be known as disciples? Because there's a difference. So imagine for a moment, what would happen if we all took a step in that direction? What if we said something like, you know what, for the next little while, we're not going to try and do everything that the Bible teaches, although there's some really good stuff in there. We're not going to try and follow the 10 Commandments. All we're going to do is we're going to focus on one thing, and that's to love one another the way Jesus loved us. What would happen if you tried that just this week, starting today until next Sunday? 7 days. What if this week you and I were to, and of course with God's help, be an unleasher of his ridiculous, over-the-top, mind-blowing, eye-popping love, and pour that out on the people in our lives, regardless of whether we think they deserve it or not? What do you say? Are you up for that? I hope so. You know, here's why. It was love like that that changed the world. It was love like that that toppled an entire empire without drawing a sword. Christian? I hope that if people call us Christians, it's because they see us loving one another the way Jesus loved us. And that's a tall order, and we're going to be talking about what it means, what it looks like to live up to the name Christian. I'm really glad that you're here with us this morning, and I get to be on this journey with you. I invite you to pray with me. God, man, there is so much division right now in our world. Maybe no more so than there was back then, but we're living this. This is our story that we're in. And right now, people are just so desperate for hope. And the local church is that hope. And when we love one another the way you loved us, when we put aside our rights and what we want for the sake of someone else, man, that just lights up everything. And that's what you call us to be, is a light. And so help us to do that. Help us to be gracious with ourselves when we trip up and we don't love people the way we should love people. But let us all just try to love each other the way you loved us, with a sacrificial love, the biggest demonstration of love this world has ever seen. Help us to do that. And we pray this in your awesome name. Amen.